Hello everyone, welcome to Expert Works RPA training. In this session, we are going to learn about what is robotic process automation, the advantages of using robotic process automation for doing the business transformation, the limitations of RPA, and we will also see how the projects are being handled using RPA technology and how we are handling the exceptions. And we will also talk about different types of robots and the security concepts of RPA technology. So let's get started. So it is important for us to understand what is the actual meaning of robotic process automation, right? So let's deep dive into that. So automation of repeatable and rule-based tasks using a software which is installed on a user's computer is called robot or bot. So whenever there is a use case or a requirement that you have to analyze, where you are transforming that particular manual process into automation process, you have to consider two important things. The process should be repeatable and the process should be rule based. Okay, so let's understand what do I mean by repeatable. Right, there will be certain processes which you execute them frequently on daily basis, or twice or thrice in a week depending on the requirement, right? So every process that you are trying to automate should be frequently utilized. Only then you will see the result or the benefit of automating that particular process. If you just run that particular process once in a year or so, you would have spent a lot of time in analyzing the process and in developing and testing the process, right? And when you deploy it and you're executing it only once in a year, you won't see the benefits that you have put in equal to the efforts that you have put into the project, right? So it is one of the foremost important thing that you have to consider if the process is repeatable or not. If not, what is the frequency that we have? And another thing that you have to consider is the volumetrics of the process. What are the volumes that you are going to handle? What are the records, number of records that the bot should process every time the process executes? So you should be knowing these details as part of the process analysis itself. And the next important thing is rule based. When I say rule based, let's take an example to make you understand this better. Okay, let's consider every day we do a lot of activities, right? And sending an email or reading an email. So let's take an example of sending an email. So what are all the steps that we do in order to send an email? We'll have to first open the browser, then log into our Gmail account, and then type in your username, password, and then you will compose an email. You will specify the true address and then the subject and the body of an email, right? So after doing all of these things, you will then click on send button and your email will be sent to the receiver, right? So every time you want to send an email to any user, okay, so you will follow these steps, right? You will have to open the browser as a mandatory step. So without opening a browser, if you are using a laptop or a desktop version, you will not be able to send an email, right? So it follows a sequence of steps, and these steps remains pretty much same every time that you have to complete this activity, right? Similarly, the processes that you are planning to automate should also follow a rule based approach in a sequential order. As a humans, we can see the changes, we can observe and we can notice the changes that are happening. Okay, because we have that intelligence and we can also see what is happening on the screen. But bot is nothing but the process that is developed by us humans, right? So it has no intelligence. It cannot adapt to the changes by its own, right? If the application itself is changing and if the sequence of the flow is changing, the bot will not be able to adapt to that change automatically. Okay, you have to make those changes to the code in case if you observe any difference in the rules or the sequential order. And in case if the rules and the sequence of a particular process order is changing frequently, then those processes are very difficult to automate or they are bound to failures and they will lead to a lot of maintenance efforts once the process is being developed. Yeah. So let's go to the next point. The bot is programmed to perform sequence of steps that a human user would do. So this is again an important and aligns with the example that we have taken in the previous point, right? So every task that we take will follow certain method to complete that task, right? So every automation or every process that you are analyzing for transforming the manual process into automation should follow certain sequential order regardless of number of times we are executing that process. Okay, and how as a humans we are completing that process in a particular order, bot also should be created. Okay, I mean the code also should be developed using these RPA tools in a similar sequential order. Okay, the sequence cannot be missed. We should really relate it with as a humans what we are doing, and you should mimic the same behavior by developing the bot or by writing the code that follows the same sequence of steps. So the third point is very important point. The bot will work exactly like a human user by interacting with user interface of an application. So this is really important for any RPA technology and for any UI based automation. Okay, so when I say by interacting with user interface, it's nothing but the graphical user interface of any application that you see on the screen. Okay, so let us take an example. Let's say we are using Facebook. So there are a lot of things that you can do in Facebook, right? You will like the photos, you will share them, you will comment on the photos, right? So you will add a lot of messages, you send messages, receive messages. So how are we doing it? How is it working? We really don't know how it is working or what integration technology they have used. We really don't bother about that, right? So but what we want to do is purely based on what we are looking on the screen. Let's say if I want to like a picture, I'll just see for the like button and then I'll click on the like button. And if I want to add a comment, I'll click on the comment and it opens a text box, and then I will add my comment, right? So what we are doing here is nothing but we never care about how it is being displayed when I type a comment, how other person is able to see it, what is the integration, what is the backend code that it is developed. We really don't think about it. We just follow what we have to do and how is it being displayed on the screen just by following the instructions on the user interface. Similarly, RPA also does the same thing. It interacts with the application by interacting with the user interface. It doesn't get integrated with the coding that the application is developed on. Okay, so this is really important point. Okay, so it just interacts with UI application. So when I say this text boxes and a like button, drop downs or check boxes, radio buttons, all of these are called as elements. So these are nothing but which makes the application, which makes the graphical user interface for you. In RPA terminology, these are referred to as an element. Okay, so RPA has got its own technology to identify where the element is existing and then take an action on it. So it is we who have to design bot in such a way that interact with those elements to complete a particular task, right? So to put it together, automation of repeatable and rule-based tasks in a sequential order by interacting with user interface of an application is called robotic process automation. So now as we know what is robotic process automation, let's go to the next slide to understand certain use cases. Right? I have actually added some simple use cases that you might see in everyday work. And the first one, calculators, right? We all of us will use calculators. So with the invention of calculators, to some extent the manual mathematical expressions have been simplified, or the complex problems also we are able to solve it through using a calculator. And now this is also being available as an application in our laptop or in our systems, right? So what we can do is we can also automate this kind of applications which is installed on our system just like how we are using that application. Similarly, we can also program or develop a bot that uses and interacts with this application to help us do some problem solving, to solve some complex problems and do some calculations and get the result from the calculation application and then add it to a source or a destination file. Okay, so that's how UiPath interacts with any application that is available on your system by interacting with user interface. Okay, so the other use case of where RPA can be implemented is data entry employee job, right? So when we talk about data entry, it's purely I mean at least 90% it is non-technical, right? Where you enter data from one source to another file, another destination file, or from one source to another source where it can be used as an output in a different process. Nothing but transferring data from one file to another file, to be simple. So this is like very repeated task, and you really don't have to spend a lot of time. People end up spending a lot of time in doing this task, which can be simply automated using these RPA tools, isn't it? Right. So what we can do here is we can rather use RPA technology in place where we can automate this task, which doesn't require any decision making skills or doesn't depend on too many conditions as well, right? It is just about manipulation or addition or verification validation of the data or updating data between various file systems. Okay, so this is a very simple use case that can be achieved using automation solution, which will reduce lot of human effort. And it's a repeated and redundant task where human intelligence is getting wasted, and they simply do this mundane task, and we can rather use or utilize that particular time that we are spending on that non technical work where actually the human intelligence is required. Okay, so this is one of the best use case where RPA can be used, best and a simple use case at the same time. And the next two examples I've mentioned is related to banking or the mortgage domain, like insurance companies, banking sector, or healthcare sector. Multiple use cases we can see with each of these domains, like insurance provider. So if we want to basically check the detail of a particular customer while they are on a call with the customer care executive, we can develop automations for that as well. The customer executive will still just execute the bot in an attended mode. We will discuss what attended mode and all in our next slides. And he can pull the information using the bot and see what are the details of that customer, what is the plan that they are having, what is the expiry date, what are the dependents, who are the dependents, and I mean how many number of dependents they have, a whole lot of details that is related to insurance. And similarly, banking sector will have lot of loan departments, right? They'll have personal loan, vehicle loan, so many other different types of loans and engagements with various customers. So to maintain or to keep track of all those details, we can still use RPA in place. It's just about analyzing the process that is being done manually today and transforming that to automation by verifying the feasibility. Okay, the first and foremost thing that you analyze is to see if the process is repeatable and if the process is in sequential or tool based order, as we discussed in our earlier slide. So next, let's then go forward with the next slide. So we will discuss about the benefits of RPA, right? So so far we have seen what RPA is about, certain use cases, and now we will see the benefits, why organizations are trying to implement RPA. Okay, so the first and foremost important thing is RPA systems mimic human behavior with no change to the existing infrastructure. So these are easy to set up because these are just interacting with any application like how a human user does. So it doesn't require any complex infrastructure to be in place, right? With existing infrastructure itself, you can get started and you can implement RPA solutions that just behaves like a human user or mimics the human behavior. as you grow as a team, where you have lot of automations in place and lot of pipeline in place, you can migrate to any cloud or you can improvise your infrastructure. But to get started, the existing infrastructure is quite good enough to complete the automations and to move them to the production environment. Okay. The next important point is it does not get integrated with the underlying software, but rather uses the software user's interface to operate on it. So this aligns with the point which we have already discussed, right? So it doesn't really interact with the backend code of the application that is developed on, but rather it just interacts with the application based on the user interface. Just like how we are using it, in the similar way, bot is also trained to use the application by looking at the user interface of the screen. Solutions can be developed faster since they are not dependent on underlying software. Yeah, because why do we say that solutions can be developed faster? Because it doesn't get integrated and it doesn't we don't have to write coding from the scratch, because the because most of the options inside UiPath is available as an activated, or a lot of activities are available for you which you just have to drag and drop them, and you should know how to use those activities. Okay, so that way, rather than developing code in any other traditional language like C or Python, which requires you to develop code from the scratch and writing line by line of code, it is quite different than how it is being implemented in RPA. The processes will work like, in a flow chart. The process will look like a flow chart, and they work by the activities that are already being automated. So these are also called as automated tools, because in case if you want to use a loop, you don't have to write every single line in order to complete the loop activity. You simply have to drag and drop the loop activity and add the condition there. Okay, we will see how this is being practically done during our next sessions. And RPA automation results in cost reduction since it reduces the need of human workforce significantly to do the same work. Okay. So once we automate a particular task, it will run repeatedly without any human intervention, right? Let's say there is a process that is being run daily twice or thrice, and you are manually doing it. And on one particular day, you thought to transform it to an automation process, and you have already transformed it by coding it by using RPA technology, right? Or RPA UiPath coding. So when you transform that particular process into automation, it runs by its own, right? Itself. It doesn't require any human intervention to start the process. It executes and completes the task successfully. Or in case if it is failing, we should be able to handle those failures as well. We will understand how we can handle those failures in our next sessions. Okay, so when we have this kind of infrastructure in place and this kind of opportunities or activities where you don't have to really write the coding from the scratch, and also will help you to run the process repeatedly without any human intervention, it will definitely give you the cost reduction, right? Automation is a one time activity. Sure, there will be maintenance, but over a period of time, the maintenance of the project also will come down. So every time you are now repeating the process, there is no need for human intervention. No human is required to review that particular process or to verify the process that is being executed, because it is developed, tested thoroughly, and only then we are executing that that particular code in the production environment, so which will significantly help in reducing the cost of the project. Yeah, so I'm saying, attended and unattended bots. So let's understand what are different types of bot and what each of that means. We have two different types of bots, attended and unattended. So when I say attended bot, it requires a manual intervention to trigger the bot. Okay, so we have completed the automation project, and rather than scheduling the bot, it will be triggered by an user or end user or a business user or a vendor. It could be anyone, but it requires a manual intervention. The bot cannot be scheduled or it will not be able to trigger by its own. It is depending on a particular person to start that automation. So depending on the requirement, we should choose which method is suitable for triggering the bot. Should you go with attended or unattended is purely based on the requirements. Okay, so on the other hand, unattended bot is nothing but the bot which will be able to execute on its own based on the schedule without any manual intervention. Okay, so let's understand this in detail by points. Bots are software programs that mimic the behavior of a human. So we have already know this, right? So whatever as a humans we do to complete a particular task, we basically program the bot also to follow the same steps. And bots automate routine tasks and eliminate inefficiencies, right? It will help us in avoiding the human errors that we make in case of data entry or in case of validations. And we have the way of repeatedly executing these processes, right? So it will basically help us in avoiding the redundant issues or validations issues that might happen in the process. And there are two types of bots, right? So one is attended and unattended, as I have explained earlier. So let's go back to the next slide and understand. So here the types of bots are front office robots and back office robots. So when I say front office robots, it is nothing but again an unattended bot. Okay, so it works in the So attended and unattended bots are also known as front office robots and back office robots. Front office robots are attended automation where it requires a manual intervention to trigger the bot. Back office robots are nothing but attended automations where unattended automation where there is no human intervention that is required to trigger the bot. Okay, so it is some people call them as attended or front office robots, back office robots, or unattended automation, but the meaning of it remains the same. And let's go to the next slide. So we will understand how automations are developed using RPA. So any development that you take with any coding technology, it follows certain standard approach, right? So how do we make sure that there is a standard approach that is being followed in the organization or within the RPA team? So in most of the organization, more or less, the steps that we are going to discuss in the next slide will be followed. Okay, at least on a high level, this is what will be done in order to complete your process end to end using RPA solutions. And it is always a structured and stage wise approach that you follow to complete the automation. So we basically divide them into four different phases: assessment phase, approval, design and development, and implement. So let's see each of this stage in detail and understand how these are being implemented. Okay. So first is an assessment stage. So as the name says, assessment, right? What you will do is you will do the assessment of the project that you are required to automate. Okay, so how will you assess that? You will assess that based on the nature of the project and based on the nature of the data that you are going to use as part of this project, and also the type of applications that you are using for this process. Okay, and you should also look at the scheduling, and if you have a pipeline in the automation, you should understand which automation will be prioritized. When I say pipeline, every organization will have lot of automation pipeline in place. So what you can do is not all of them will have the same priority, right? Some processes will be more priority than compared to other processes. So those processes you can basically give priority, and you can automate those processes and keep the less priority ones later. Okay, and after the assessment stage, you will move ahead with the approval stage. Once you have the assessment in place with what you can do on how you are doing it and what is the time it will take and what is the importance of, of developing that particular process, you will submit your documentation or the points for the approval, right? Once you have the approval, okay, and it's not only about the management approval, it's also about the user, the business user or the end user approval, where where they will have to sign off whether we have actually understood the requirements or not. Okay, we require these basic approvals in place in order to move ahead with the next steps in our project. And design, the third phase is the design phase, which is very important phase in the automation. As part of the design phase, you will look at what all the applications that are being used and how do you represent the business use case and transform that business use case into automation. So how is it being done manually and how you are going to convert that particular process using RPA in place. Okay, and you would also look at scaling of this particular automation as part of designing. When I say scaling, today you have only 10 customers, so you have to send reminders to this 10 customers, email reminder to 10 customers. So you have automated this process, but tomorrow the number might increase, it might become 100, might become 1000 and lakhs. So how do you scale that automation? You should be prepared for scaling your automation as well, increasing the scope of the automation based on the volume of the process. Okay, so that's just a simple example to help you understand. So the designing phase will end with the testing. Okay, you will design the process, you will develop that using UiPath tool, and then you will also test it. And that's when the designing phase will get completed and we will move on to the implementation phase. In implementation phase, we will be deploying the process that we have completed in the previous stages. Okay, when I say deployment, every organization will have minimum of 2 or 3 environments. Okay, one is the development environment where the developers will be developing the code and testing it. The second environment will be the QA environment where it is purely used for testing purposes or UAT purpose, user acceptance testing purpose. And the third environment will be production environment. Once you complete the development and testing, you will be moving the code to the production. Okay, production is the last stage, that is deploying your code to the production where it can be executed based on the schedules or based on the manual triggering. Okay, so that is the last stage of your particular process, and after which you can just maintain the process based on the errors, based on the stability of the code, or if there is any change requirement or the application changes that are coming from the end user or the business owners. Yeah. So in this slide, we are going to talk about how we are going to handle exceptions, right? So this is very important exception handling mechanism, because every process that you develop is will fail at one or other point of time, right? So you will have to make sure that you are keeping these failures minimal to make your code more stable, and in case if there is any failure, you should be able to handle those exceptions so your process will fail gracefully. Okay, it will not abruptly close the process and exits from the automation, but rather it will continue to handle those exceptions. So how do we handle that? We will talk about it orally now to get an high level understanding. We will also cover this topic in detail with some practical example in our next upcoming sessions. Okay, so exceptions arise when dealing with software program and should be handled properly. So any software programs or applications that you use can you know can face an issue with an exception. The exception could be anything, right? It could be an application exception or a system exception. The application might crash or it might go down for some time. right? I mean, it may not even load properly. So these are all exceptions, right, which will prevent you from doing a particular task. If the exception is left unhandled, it could drastically impair RPA functionality. Okay, so if we don't handle that exception, what will happen? The process will fail and it doesn't try to attempt that particular step again. Okay, it will not try to load the page again. It just tries once and then fails. It will not try to reload the page, or it will not try to go ahead with the next steps. So it is very important for us to handle those exceptions. The success of exception handling depends on how well it is implemented during development. Okay, so during the development phase itself, you should be aware of what exceptions that you might see while the process is executing, and you should be able to implement them in your process. That's about good designing of the process. Okay, you have to assume this exception might happen, and in case if it happens, how do I handle that? You should have that thought process in place in order to make sure that your process is completing successfully and failing gracefully. Okay, the last point, it ensures the problems are resolved, easily identifiable and repairable by system admins, right? So when I say it fails gracefully, it will fail with a log message, it will fail with some details, and it will note down the reason for the failure. So we will know what is causing that failure, and it is easy for us to debug that issue and fix that issue and rerun the process again, right? So these are all some of the important points that you have to keep in your mind for understanding how to handle those exceptions, and to understand the importance of having exception mechanism in your development. And coming back to the exception types, there are two different exception types or important exception types: business exceptions and system exceptions. And there could be other type, application exceptions also. So let's deep dive in detail. The next slide talks about the business exceptions. So let's take an example of a business exception. Okay, so let's say that you are using a banking application to transfer some funds. Okay, the maximum funds that you can transfer in a day is set to maybe 10,000 rupees. Okay, as your limit, and you have already transferred that amount to your other bank or to other person, right? And you are trying to do another 10,000. Will you be allowed to do? No, because the bank had set an exception rule saying the person's threshold limit is only within 10,000 or equal to 10,000, and none of the transactions can be made above 10,000 rupees in a particular day. Right? So these are exceptions, these are nothing but the rules on which the business is working. So you should know these rules well in advance as part of your requirement itself, to understand if you have to add these exceptions in your process to make it stable and more convenient for the users who is dependent on these automations. Right? So you will handle this by using the exception mechanisms that is available in UiPath. And I also told about the system exceptions, right? So some examples of system exceptions are application not responding, or application crashes, or the user interface itself is changing. Right? The application team had decided that they wanted to change the way the user interface of application will look like. So as UiPath is completely dependent on the user interface, it will not be able to adapt to the changes, and it will simply fail. So it is important to inform the business users or end users to let us know in case if their applications is going any user interface changes, so we can better handle those changes to keep the failures in minimum. Yeah. So we also should understand how secure is RPA, because we are dealing with various applications, right? Though it is through user interface, we have visibility to the data. We can still get the data from those applications and use it in different applications as well, some other applications as well. So people are always, the end users or the business teams or the clients are always curious to know how secure is RPA, right? So every application you take in general should have some security in place to make sure that it is giving the right kind of access to the users and it is not violating any underground rules and regulations that are being already established. So how can you answer if someone asks you how secure is RPA? So you should know that, right? So RPA, not only UiPath, most of the RPA tools are secure to use and they use 256-bit authentication. Okay, and to prevent the security flaws that might happen using these RPA tools, they have come up with role-based access control. Okay, which means you can define the roles of each user that is accessing this particular tool. Okay, if it is a developer, you can limit the activities or the usage of that particular developer to only what he is required to. If a person is a support person who is maintaining the process after deployment, he will not have visibility to the code. He will not have visibility to the versions of the code that is checked into the repository. Okay, so these are some of the examples where role-based access can be used. It is nothing but giving the role to a particular person based on his usage, based on his requirements, not less than that or not more than that, with approvals in place. Okay, so this by having this RBAC, role based access control, in place, we can easily eliminate unauthorized roles or access to the applications. So I have actually given the same details in this slide, what I have just spoke about. Some examples of giving role-based access control to developer, to tester, and the support team. And as part of role-based access or as part of security, we should also understand how the credentials are being managed in UiPath. So this is again comes under the security concepts of RPA, right? So every application username or credentials are very confidential and you cannot make it visible for everyone who is using this tool. Okay, so UiPath uses credentials in the form of assets where you can configure them in Orchestrator. We will talk more about Orchestrator in our later sessions, but for now understand Orchestrator as a component of UiPath itself, which is a web-based browser or browser-based application. Okay, so we have an component called assets where you can store your configurations or application passwords inside those assets. Okay, and the other way to handle the credential management, to use third party applications like CyberArk or password vault management systems like AWS Secrets Key, etc. Right, like CyberArk application has a plugin that is provided within UiPath to make the integration very easy, where we can connect to the CyberArk and fetch the details of the user credentials from the CyberArk vault management system and use them in our UiPath. So it provides additional layer of security. Okay, so this is about credential management, right? So this is the basic introduction of RPA in general. So let's review from the beginning what we have discussed. Okay, so the first important thing is to understand what is RPA. RPA is nothing but rule based and sequential order of executing the process using interface of an application. Right? And then we also discussed about various types or different types of bots we have and RPA implementation methodology. We also covered how do we handle exceptions on a very high level, and we also talk about some security concepts of RPA. Okay, so in our next topic we will be covering about UiPath tool. How do you first download the tool, how do you interact with the tool, and the various components inside the tool. This is basically to get you familiarized with the navigation of various components inside UiPath tool. Okay, so that's all for this session. Thank you everyone.